Proceeding will start shortly. The 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 proceeding will start shortly The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
And in addition from hearing from the four of you here today, we've also had powerful written submissions from many other friends and relatives of people sadly taken their lives at university. So we do understand that this is an issue that affects far too many people, not all of whom that we can hear from today, but we thought it would be important for you initially if you could introduce yourselves and just tell us a bit about your experience, if you're comfortable with that. So Lee, as the petition creator, can we start with you?
Yes, and good afternoon, and can I just say thank you to the committee for giving us an opportunity to speak and also to share our lived experience. I think it's also important just to reflect that actually there's three of us here today, but behind us are far too many families that have shared a similar experience of loss with their children whilst they're at university, and also 128,000 people that supported our petition. What I would say is that 2018, my world and my family's world completely changed. My son went off to university full of expectation and hope, and I, like many other parents, was under an assumption that our universities had some degree of responsibility for the support and care of our children, albeit that they are adults, which we accept. But what I learned following my son's death is actually I was misinformed. That's actually not the case. And when my son died by suicide at university, there were certain things that I expected would have happened. The university were aware that he was struggling with his mental health. They were aware that he had expressed some suicidal thoughts. As his family, we were the last to know that that was going on. We were never told. We were never given an opportunity to provide any support or intervention or work with the university to stop that from happening. And what I strongly believe, and the rest of us believe, is that had certain practical, simple steps been in place and been implemented throughout the sector, my son would still be alive, and so would other children at university still be alive. We've learned a lot along the way with engagement with the sector, with Universities UK, and what I identified really is a sector that is far too protective of its autonomy. that effectively you have 200 plus independent businesses with very little level of scrutiny at all about how they conduct their businesses, and that they are hesitant and very slow to change and learn from these tragedies. And so that's my experience, and that's what we have collectively been doing for the last 4 to 5 years, is trying to bring this issue to the fore.
Thank you, Lee. Really appreciate you sharing your experience. I don't know who wants to go next. Hilary, are you happy to go next?
Yeah. Hi, my name's Hilary Grime. I lost my daughter Phoebe in June 2021. She was at Newcastle University. I just want to sort of clear up a question. I think some people might wonder why we're here, as our children have already died. But we're here because we can't bring back those that we've lost, but we can make change so that others don't have to go through what we're going through. So it's been the hardest of journeys for all of us to go over and over what happened in order to explain our point, but we've had to do that, and I look forward to no longer having to share Phoebe and mine's story to everybody to do this, but we're going to keep doing it. Why we're here: students don't have the time or the know-how how to fight this battle. An individual couldn't take on universities and governments. It couldn't be done alone. You have to have something really terrible to happen to make you want to do this. This is a really hard thing to have to do. And you have to be really hard pushed to fight this battle, but we're not giving up. So at last we have got together. We've got a group of really strong, focused, intelligent and driven people who will make change. We can make a difference to the students in the UK, current and future, and our children who have tragically died would have wanted us to do that. So that is why we're here.
Thank you. And Ben?
Yeah, of course. My name is Ben. I'm a mental health campaigner. So I actually lost my brother to suicide in 2018 while we were both at secondary school. So I didn't lose him at university, but I've been working in the mental health space non-clinically for 5 years now. I went to university in 2018, Liverpool. I was a mental health campaigner there. I was focusing on schools and teaching and student mental health in secondary school and primary school. I extended that to universities during the pandemic and had quite a vocal voice on social media, especially during the pandemic, around university mental health. Through that, I got in touch with a lot of students that were desperately struggling, met all of the families that are involved with this, heard all the stories, and I'm here to try and bring a recent student voice to this, but also bring all the stories I've heard from so many incredible people to life. I also went to school with Phoebe. Phoebe was the most caring person. I think it's quite prophetic that we're here talking about duty of care, inspired by such a caring individual. That's my role here. In terms of what we're asking for, you've got the evidence. There are many ridiculously simple, basic mistakes that have been made. Consistently, as a student, as a general population, we're told that universities take this seriously, that it's a priority to them, that it's commitment. You've got it in front of you in black and white. You know, there's paperwork not being filled in correctly. There's ambulances and police not being called to scenes where there's life-threatening. There's obviously life-threatening. There's really basic things that are not going right. But because the guidance at the moment is so optional and so voluntary, there's no accountability for when that goes wrong, and there's no learning and no progress for getting it right again. So I think we've done a lot of great work in the voluntary aspect of this. It is absolutely essential that we have the conversation about creating a statutory requirement for universities to operate in a legally safe way that is standard across the sector.
Okay, thank you. And Mark?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, panel, for inviting me here today. My name's Mark Shanahan. I'm the father of Rory Shanahan, who took his life at Sheffield University back in 2018. I also work within the sector. As I was then, I am now. I'm a politics lecturer working in university. I've been a head of department, personal tutor for many years, and a senior personal tutor. I've seen the university sector change considerably over the last 10 years. We're not here today to sort out the financial troubles that the sector faces. nor are we here to sort out the wider issues that connect into the NHS. But what I've seen is a growing number of students who are perhaps a little less resilient than generations past, who really do need our support throughout their whole student journey, from when they're first so excited to arrive in their first week, to the times when things are brilliant, the highs, but then the lows, when the relationships fail, when the work gets a little bit harder, when the weather's bad and they don't get out for a while. Universities are communities. They are a community of care, or so they should be. But what we are finding is that while there are many fantastic things that go on in a lot of universities for most of the time, there isn't a consistency of practice. Students don't get the parity of approach. They don't see consistency from us between departments or between institutions or across the academic and professional teams within universities. As an academic, I can't hand on heart point to great clarity in what my role or my colleagues' role is in our pastoral part of our work. And when the handovers come to the professionals who we are delighted to work with, we see a statutory duty of care as putting a stake in the ground. The culture of universities will move towards that. Things are not going to change overnight, but we need the law to get universities to act consistently, find their different ways to get to that duty of care. But what we want are competent communities that care about their students. It's far too patchy. UUK have said that already.
Thank you, Mark. Nick's going to be leading the debate when we have it here in Parliament. So, Nick, have you got some questions you'd like to ask?
Yeah. Thank you all for coming in today, and I'm ever sorry for your losses. They are tragic. Every young death is. So, and we need to try and obviously make sure this don't happen again. That's the whole point, so I understand that. There'll be some obviously difficult questions that we have to ask, because we've obviously got to get a solution to this. It's not just a case of yes, we'll do that. We need to really know why. The government have already responded to your petitions and saying that there is already a general duty of care not to cause harm. That's their answer to it at this moment in time. I suppose your job really is to convince them otherwise. So, can you just tell me why you don't think that is good enough, really?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've read the government's response. I'd say it's a typical response. We've actually lost track of the number of ministers that are in charge of higher education since we started in 2018. And what we've consistently heard as a response from our concerns from government is two things. Is one, what they expect the sector to do, and what they expect the sector to do is provide a general duty of care, and that this general duty of care already exists, is what they would say. Well, our response is that actually the government needs to take account of some recent legal judgments around this, because you read any glossy university prospectus, it will tell you and reassure families that there's some form of moral care, ethical care towards students, or this idea of a general duty of care. When that's actually been tested in court, two very, very distinct things have happened. A university has defended its claim of negligence by saying it owes no duty of care to a student, despite in its prospectuses and in all of its publications saying we accept we have a moral duty. And then a judge has actually ruled there is no statutory duty of care, and it does not exist. There is no duty that exists to students required by universities. But we simply say this: somebody somewhere has got confused, because we have a legal judgment now in the UK, the first time this notion of a general duty of care has been tested in the UK against our universities. And two very distinct things have happened. One of the universities has said, actually, no, we don't have a duty of care. That's our defence to negligence. It doesn't exist. Well, that is at odds with the government statement. And then we've had a legal ruling that's actually agreed and ruled in favour of that university. So we say the government is not taking into account the legal context here, and that actually, at the moment, what a statutory duty of care will do is actually provide clarity to that point and actually answer that question properly, so that everybody is clear, both the sector, students, parents, academics working within it, actually, well, what is our statutory requirement?
So the prospectus are saying that there is a duty of care, there's a moral duty of care.
Yeah.
The government saying that there is a general duty of care,
Yeah.
but then when it was tested in the courts, there is actually no duty of care. So, in all fairness, the universities ought to remove that from their prospectus until the government, and then you're saying the government should put an actual general, should put a duty of care in, and then that should actually go back in the prospectus then, because at this moment they're all at odds with each other.
They're totally contradiction. To me, it's almost a bit of a confidence trick going on in exercising PR here, in as much as when recruitment drives are on for universities, they open up their doors to young students who at that time actually are children at 17 with their parents, and they are openly, publicly saying they have a moral duty or a general duty of care to take in consideration the welfare of students, and that's not the case, so they are misleading.
Thank you. Would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the point. It's hugely misleading, and for a lay person or a mother or someone that's not in that, and they read general duty of care, they would assume that it means that there is a law. That's what they're telling people. It's not till you look into it and you go, actually, there is no law. So when I had the inquest, which, like all of us, was pretty horrendous, and it just revealed all sorts of things which I thought weren't right, or the main thing it revealed was that there was absolutely nothing to stop it happening to somebody else, like Phoebe coming again to Newcastle. Same thing happened. There's no prevention, there's no looking into it. They said that they thought she wasn't high risk, although they knew she was, and they took my phone number and they said they'd ring me, all sorts of things. So when I just thought, well, you know what, I'm going to see what I can do to stop this happening again, because this cannot be right. I went to a really eminent lawyer and I said, this can't be right, what's happening. I need to take it further. And he said to me, you can't. I said, what do you mean? I can't, I can. He said, you can't, there's no law, you can't do that. So what is unbelievable is that there is a duty of care in employment law. So for all of you and all of the university staff, they're all covered by employment law. But this isn't so for students at universities. And who would know that? Who knows that?
That's, I think, where the kickback's going to come, is because they say, well, look, these are not children, these are granted, I mean, as a parent, you can argue with that sometimes, especially when they're just 18,
yeah.
But they are an adult, so that's where the kickback's going to come there. But you've just said there, obviously, if you was employed, your employer has a duty of care. So is it the relationship between the university and the student that's been tested here, rather than anything else?
Yeah, it's between the university and the student, yeah.
I'm just coming on that point, and it's an interesting point. We've got this rather binary argument about age, and the point is that vulnerability can strike any of us at any time, at any age, whether you're 18 or 80. The issue is for my employer, so when if you can imagine, I was a police officer for 30 years, and I was still in the police when Daniel died. My world was completely shattered when my son died. But somehow I had to go back to work. Now, as my employer, my work didn't say, well, you're an adult, sort this out for yourself. They said, okay, we've got a duty of care here to respond to one of our members of staff who needs support at the moment in the workplace. There was no way I could function at the same level I was functioning at before my son's death. And now, morally, that was the right thing to do. And you'd say, well, morally, that's what a good employer does. But also, actually, what an employer recognises is they have a legal obligation to respond in that way. And this is exactly the same as to students. All right, if those students were actually in FEs at 18 and 19, there's a duty. But because they're in university and suddenly there's 18, there's nothing. There's no responsibility on the universities at all, statutorily, to provide any sort of support in terms of how they conduct their business. And I think the other point that we also need to be very mindful around the debate about this is that this isn't just at the crisis end around suicide. This is across all levels of what universities do in terms of their procedures and their practices, okay, and their businesses, because what a statutory duty does is require all employees to look through the lens of their employers, so in this case students, and say, okay, we need to make sure we are not unwittingly causing foreseeable harm, and that we are mitigating against that in all of our practices. And we're saying that university students at the moment are an outlier. They are a complete outlier in the terms of statutory protection that they have. My students have more statutory protection when they go and do their part-time working job to fund their degree when they're than when they are sat in front of me academically in the academic institution.
Paul, did you want to come in?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Chair. I joined the recent Learn Network event that you organised in Parliament and listened to all of the deeply moving contributions and spoke separately to Mark about his experience in Sheffield. I've no doubt that you have shone a light in your campaign on failures across the system and inconsistency in practice between the universities. I guess though my question is whether a duty of care, the imposition of a duty of care, is the right tool to achieve what you're looking for, or whether, for example, and I take the point about kind of expectations and requirements that you made a moment ago, or whether, for example, the OFS couldn't fulfil its regulatory role by making clear requirements on universities for how they should operate in this area.
I'll answer briefly and then I'll actually hand over to Mark if I can, because Mark's got much more experience of the OFS than I have. You could go down that route, but I think what we need to acknowledge here is the other side of this is we have tried to influence and work with UUK for a number of years now to try and influence policy, practice and procedures to address some of these things. And sometimes we thought we've been successful. You know, UUK have introduced guidance around information sharing for trusted contacts, post-vention responses. But what then becomes very self-evident is the sector can choose to completely ignore this best practice advice and this guidance that goes out. Now, to your question about the OFS, well, the OFS also issued guidance to the sector around what should universities' response be to issues such as sexual harassment, okay, and sexual offending going on in higher educations. And they've realised that actually they now need to make that a statutory requirement because so many universities were just ignoring the non-regulatory request to operate in this space and drive improvements. So in theory, the OFS could potentially make some improvements in this. But I'm not convinced at the moment that they have the necessary tools to properly drive change at pace through the whole sector. But I'll be interested in Mark's thoughts on that as well.
Mark.
Yes, I'll just pick up from Lee. I think he's actually covered most of what I would have said anyway. The OFS should have teeth. If it has teeth, they are very, very well hidden at the moment. In fact, I think it is suffering from very poor dentistry. What gets measured gets done. What gets backed by regulation, by legislation, gets measured. And at the moment, without the legislation there, the sector has too much wiggle room. So we have seen 5 years of a glacial pace of change because of the voluntary environment that exists at the moment. We've also seen massive inconsistency. There are over 200 degree awarding institutions in the United Kingdom. You could probably look at their processes and come up with 300 different models within that. And this is an area too where I wouldn't say the OFS has particular expertise. When complaints have been raised to them, they've got bogged down. They've become very bureaucratic. They haven't led to solutions. And I think what we would all like, wherever we are in this debate today, is for solutions to emerge from this. We actually believe, Paul, that the statutory duty of care is the best way to kickstart change, to get away from this glacial, slow move where a policy might look wonderful when the Vice-Chancellor is shaking hands with the Mayor as it is introduced, but it sits on a shelf or in a Teams drive. It certainly doesn't filter its way through the academic and professional communities, and when something goes wrong, there is still no accountability through law. That has to change.
Did you want to come back, or shall I bring Tonya in?
I'm conscious of time, so...
Yeah, well, that leads very well on to my next question, and I'll continue with you then, Mark, if you don't mind, because you've just been talking about the new duty of care. Can you tell me what changes you would like to see to this duty of care?
Yes, certainly. And I join you actually from Swansea University this afternoon, where it's probably wholly appropriate that I'm sitting in a little office beside wellbeing. We don't actually see massive change within universities. This is not revolution, but probably it is a speedy evolution. So we want to work within the system. We don't want to smash the system and break it. We have a very good university system that, when it works well, is fit for purpose and can deliver that reasonable protection from foreseeable harm for students. We don't want anything that's retributive because universities are learning organisations. Strangely, when issues go horribly wrong and lead to suicides, universities don't seem to want to learn greatly. But what we would look for is all universities reviewing and risk assessing all of their processes and making that a student-centred review. We want to create these competent communities and teams that really care. What that means within universities is consistent practice. It means policies that are student-centred. It means that they are delivered appropriately. And this affects all staff. This is not just the senior personal tutor or the wellbeing team. It could be the gardener or the marketeer or the person from estates who sees a student in estate. What we would like to see is the opportunity to work with universities. They are the experts in this. We're not going to impose and mandate solutions at all. We just want to get this law in place and then work with universities, with the likes of your third sector groups that you're talking to later, to build the appropriate culture. At the moment, the culture tends to be far too defensive and also reactive. So we want a culture that is built around prevention in the first place, so that the person with blues can be identified as different from the person with suicidal thoughts. We want all staff trained so that they know when the interventions are required, where there is a real problem and how that is sorted out. And if things go horribly wrong, what's the post-vention? How do we learn from this? How do we stop it happening again? For many institutions, it will not be major change. It is probably a more effective use of resource. It's based on best practice, and it is drawing on initiatives that already exist, but far too few universities and other HE providers buy into them. Student Minds, great charter. 5 universities have got that charter. That's nowhere near enough. UK's own suicide prevention guidelines, probably less than a third of the sector actually bought into that. This is why the voluntary approach, I'm afraid, simply doesn't work.
Thanks, Mark. And do Lee or Hilary have anything to add to that? Because I want to go to Ben last then.
I want to say something a bit more fundamental, being a mother and not being a lecturer or anything else. So from what I see it is what we really want is we need just statutory duty care for universities to protect our students from reasonably foreseeable harm caused either by direct injury or a failure to act. So if you take, we want our students protected from reasonably foreseeable harm. For me, that's really easy to understand, and everybody should understand, is that we just want universities and the staff and everybody in them to do what's reasonable. And if they did that, we are sort of fairly sure that our children would be alive today and we wouldn't be here. And that's what we're wanting. And we're not asking them to be treated as children. We want them treated as adults. And we want the same treatment as you would as employment law. So as I said, you treat your staff, you do it with, when you're with reason. And it's not, you can't have laws all underneath that govern all the different parts, because every person's different, every situation's different. But overall, just act reasonably. And then that would stop the fear in universities that staff have. Am I doing the right thing? Should I or shouldn't I? I don't know whether I should contact the parent. Should I tell somebody else? Should I tell the tutor? Should I share this information? And then if you have an inquest and you stand up and the university says, I believe I acted reasonably and everything I did was reasonable to do with the student, you would say, okay, then, that is fair. And if that student, took their life, then so be it. But they have to act reasonably, and it's just common sense and logical and fair and right, and it's what it needs to happen, and that's it. It's not complicated.
Yeah. And you've been a student and you lost your brother. What impact do you think this would have on the student experience?
Great question. I mean, to be honest, for the majority of students that don't interact with these support services, that don't necessarily have, nothing should change. And I think a lot has been made of a statutory duty of care, a lot of, whatever you want to call it, scaremongering or misunderstanding about student privacy being affected or student autonomy being affected. For the majority of students, this is not going to have an impact on their student experience at all. But we know, because they're in the room and we've got the evidence a bit and the data's there, that for 100 students a year, it's going to be the last year of their life. It's a terrible situation to be in. The statutory duty of care, for me, is about intervening with those people that are desperate for that support. When you have a student email you saying they're going to take their own life that evening, it's not good enough to get a reply being, we'll see you in 3 to 5 working days, or we'll get a proper response in 3 to 5 working days. When a member of staff goes into a student accommodation and finds a student in a life-threatening situation, it's not good enough to say we'll pick it up in the morning and then come back the next day to find them dead. You have to know to phone an ambulance and have those policies in place. These are emergency policies and these are support policies that most students will not come into contact with. But if they do need them, they're there. In exactly the same way with employment. Most people don't need all these policies, these support policies. But when they need them, they're there. And if they don't get used, then they're held accountable to that. Because accountability here is really important. These families have not had any accountability when things have gone wrong. And we can see things have gone wrong because it's all in front of us. And so it's really important that we create accountability. We've seen through UK guidance, there's 39% less maybe in terms of the whole sector adopting voluntary guidance. I always think if something's voluntary to adopt, then it's also voluntary to not. And so whilst we're giving people voluntary advice, it's up to them whether they use it or not. It's up to them whether they leave it on the desk and actually write the policies into their university or not. But it's also up to them to use those policies in the moment. If you get a suicidal student come to you right now in a university, whatever you feel like doing in that moment is absolutely fine. And the law says nothing about what you should and shouldn't be doing. And that leaves a lot of gaps, and there's a lot of amazing people working in universities, and they do deserve credit because there are a lot of amazing people working. I had Denise, who was student support when I was there, absolutely lovely, really, really lovely woman. There are amazing people working here, but they don't know what they're expected to do. They're not given any learning from experiences that have gone past. And accountability is so important because we've got to learn lessons and people need to know what their roles are. What are laws and responsibilities if not pointing at someone and going, this is what you're required to do? And at the moment, people don't know what they're required to do. And I just go back to my point, if it's voluntary to adopt, it's voluntary to not adopt. And I think that's really important to remember here, because we've seen so many universities not just ignore the guidance, but actually take it on and not do anything with it. And they've got nothing to lose by doing that. And unfortunately, we see the result of that behind me and in the paperwork you've got.
Robin, did you want to come in?
Thank you. Just a very quick one, and totally appreciate you made a very persuasive case and the pattern in which you argued. Both Lee and Hilary mentioned not being contacted and not being reached out to around the issues affecting children, and this seems to be one of the key concerns in this. And yet, you've drawn the comparison with employment rights. I don't think an employer has any responsibility to have a next of kin and be in touch with them in circumstances where they come across mentally. Is there a separate issue that needs to be addressed there around making sure that actually there is a named contact, a family contact or next of kin for all students? And would that be covered by a duty of care?
So we worked with the sector in UUK to produce guidance around the use of trusted contacts. And in spite of that, there's still too much confusion in the sector here around GDPR. And so in 2018, 2019, a number of us started engaging with the Information Commissioner's office to get clarity around this issue. And the ICO is very, very clear on public record that if a life is at imminent risk, okay, then you should share whatever information is necessary, okay, to protect somebody's life. It makes no distinction about the age of that person or indeed the context in which that happens. But the reality is you've got academics that are not being trained in this space. They're not completely aware of what the rules are. The sector itself gets confused between obtaining consent and sharing information. And despite the best practice, UUK has no means of knowing that its members have adopted that at all. It has no implementation strategy for this best practice that we've worked on. And that's just simply not good enough. And what we say about, to your point about would a statutory duty of care assist? Well, the point about statutory duty of care is to say, right, we've now got best practice. The statutory duty of care, if you do not implement best practice, means you have some accountability as an institution to explain why you've not followed that best practice guidance. Why have you not ensured that your staff have been trained in that best practice? And why didn't you implement it? And that's why we say a statutory duty is the only lever now that we can see that's going to get the sector to actually start implementing best practice. You know, we say best practice should not be voluntary in this space. And then currently it is.
Can I just jump in as well? On your point, I find the word best practice or the phrase best practice absolutely so confusing. We know, and you talk to anyone, and you'll hear from people after us that will also repeat this. The best practice we have, and I'm sure everyone here will agree, is potentially life-saving. So why on earth are we calling it best practice, not basic practice? We've got life-saving policies that we say are best practice. Here they are. Adopt them if you want. Why on earth are they best practice? You know, health and safety laws are laws and statutory, not voluntary, for a reason. Because they point at an employer or they point at a construction company and say, you've got to wear hard hats. And if you don't wear hard hats, you're breaking the law. If it was voluntary, they wouldn't do it. And in terms of the emergency contacts, I think there's a really... when we talk about students, it's this weird shadow zone where it's not quite, they're not children, but they're not adults. And I think for a lot of people, the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, we've got to treat them as adults because they're over 18. And they absolutely need to be dealt with as adults. You know, I wouldn't have wanted loco parentis or anything of that nature while I was at university. But in the same way, like Lee was saying, with employment law, if you walk into an office and your member of staff or your team member is saying you're going to go and take their own life that night, and you don't do anything, are we really going to say that's okay? But if you were to go to your tutor at university and say, I'm going to take my life tonight, we've got evidence that nothing's happened, and they're not accountable to that at all. And so the emergency contacts thing is a really interesting part of this. I think there's a lot to work out in terms of privacy around it, but the phrase that we're going with here, and the phrase that Hilary mentioned earlier, is we're taking reasonable steps. What do we think is a reasonable step to save the life of a student or support a student? And actually, for a lot of them, it is getting into contact with a family member or someone like that. Reasonable steps is what is important, and it's different steps that would be reasonable in a workplace. And I think comparing university adults to workplace adults makes sense in some situations, but it's a different environment, and we do have to deal with it differently.
Yeah. Mark, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, just a very, very quick one. Universities work within frameworks very happily. We have the Research Excellence Framework, we have the Teaching Excellence Framework. Neither of those are voluntary. They get done. Universities strive to do them incredibly well. Why don't we have a Support Excellence Framework, which brings all of these issues that we're talking about today for the whole student journey, from that first arrival to the brilliant graduation, because that's what we want. And we want 100% of students going through all of that process, not 100 dying every year at their own hands.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, all of you, for answering our questions. I think it's been incredibly rich to hear from you, and I appreciate how challenging it is, but how powerful your testimony is, so thank you. Could we have our next panel? We have Jed Flynn and Dominic Smithies to join, and we've got Chloe Field, who's also joining us virtually.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. So we have Jed, who's the Chief Exec of Papyrus here today. We have Dominic Smithies, who is the Influencing and Advocacy Lead from Student Minds. And online we have Chloe Field, who's the Vice President for Higher Education for the National Union of Students. So thank you so much. And I'm going to hand over to Marsha, who's got questions for you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to each of you, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. You would have heard we've had some powerful testimonies from the witnesses before on their experiences of loss, and sadly we know that these are not isolated incidents. In 2020, one university student died by suicide every 6 days in England and Wales. So my question really is, what do you think lies behind these tragedies, and what do you think could help to reduce the number of suicides? And if possible, can I just start with you, Ged, please?
Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this conversation, and secondly, from my heart, my deepest sympathy to people sitting right behind me and the many people in the room who are not just here because of suicide, but because of our suicide, and to prevent future deaths. The Papyrus started 25 and a half years ago by parents like the ones you've just met, who didn't want to be here, who didn't want to have to talk about these matters, but were forced into it by dint of the fact that they had lived experience of suicide. If I had the answer to your question, Marsha, what lies behind these tragedies, I'd be a very wise man, and I'm not. The longer I'm in this game, and it's not a game, but it's the wrong word, the more I realise how complex suicide is. The contributory factors to suicide are so many and so varied. Each story is indeed unique, but there are commonalities in those stories which we must learn from. And my first observation of the conversation so far has been that many of the issues that are being raised are not actually peculiar to the higher education sector. So I sat on the National Advisory Group for Government for the last 12 years around suicide prevention, and it struck me that for many years now, in England and Wales, a coroner can reach a suicide conclusion and often will prepare a prevention of future death report, and that will go to a third party, for example, a GP surgery or a GP cluster or a department of government. And nothing is done about those apart from a response. So my point is that we're still not learning from deaths to prevent future deaths, in spite of having the mechanisms to do so. We need to improve that beyond this particular sector.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. Sorry about this.
But that these concerns are not peculiar to that sector doesn't mean they're any less real. And, you know, my heart and my head are with the families who've presented their concerns to you today. Personally, I'm not yet convinced that the statutory duty of care is the right way, and I'll say that openly, but that's just as one person, really. But I definitely am with these families in their pursuit of learning from loss so that we can prevent future deaths, because suicide is very much a preventable death.
Thank you very much for that, Good. Dominic, can I come to you?
Hello, and thank you for having me. I'd like to echo a lot of the sentiment shared there in thanking the parents and the campaigners that brought this petition before you. It's always great to see how much energy there is to talk about preventing deaths by suicide and addressing student mental health more broadly. I agree in acknowledging the complexity of student suicide, and my worry would be in trying to present any solution as a silver bullet when there probably needs to be a myriad of interventions and approaches taken in order to address this and prevent as many deaths as possible. At Student Minds, we take the position that an improvement approach is needed, which is why we did set up the University Mental Health Charter. It takes a whole university approach, acknowledging that the issue of dealing with student mental health doesn't sit just within support services, but sits within how we embed wellbeing within pedagogy, within curriculum, how we look at the learning environment of students, the physical environment, the communities we build on campuses. And part of the improvement approach is recognising that we really need to be ready to meet universities where they currently are. I think it's been shared in acknowledging the sectors at very different points with their journeys in supporting students understanding what they can do to support them as best as possible. But the sector is incredibly diverse. The student population that we're supporting is incredibly diverse. I think by default we often think of students as the 18-year-old fresh to university population, but it's incredibly important we recognise that the population includes mature students, international students, students studying remotely, potentially having absolutely zero contact with their university in person. So recognising that introducing any kind of parity or standardisation could have equality implications for how students are supported. So just acknowledging the diversity of the sector is important to us so that we can get them to recognise their own local context and improve on their own practice as much as possible.
Thank you. Chloe, can I ask you?
Yeah, thank you for having me here. And also, again, I echo what everyone else has said. My condolences to the families, and thank you so much for raising such a massive issue that is the crisis of student mental health. Talking about the causes of mental health amongst students, again, there is loads of complexities. A lot of people already arrive at university with a history of mental health. There's many things that can cause mental illness, but we're talking about stuff that's circumstantial or that can exacerbate mental health. The biggest one that we see time and time again from speaking to students, from our kind of the conferences that we have on big issues, the surveys that we run, time and time again, it comes down to financial reasons. We've especially seen it during the cost of living crisis, where 90% of students reported that the cost of living crisis was already having an impact on their mental health in the autumn, and 24% said that it was having a major impact. I think Student Minds also reported that 59% of students with diagnosed mental illnesses said that managing money was a cause of stress, often or all of the time. This is due to a multitude of reasons, not just because of the stress of managing finances and struggling to pay bills, but Also, working multiple part-time jobs is such a strain when especially if you're doing like a full-time degree. You lose a lot of time socializing, being able to relax, look after your own well-being. This can also cause isolation, and obviously the sort of people who are more likely to experience financial strains are working class students. So there's definitely a class aspect to this and a financial aspect. Also, NHS services are incredibly hard to access as it is. If you're a student, it's even more hard because you're in your university city half the time and your hometown, well, you're likely to be in your hometown the other half. So it's difficult to get long-term support. But I would say, I'll just try and wrap up the answer quickly so I don't want to take up too much time. But in terms of answers, there is not one quick fix answer. But if we're talking about actually trying to resolve the issue of student mental health, the system of universities, higher education is just not fit to support students. Students are treated as kind of pound signs, and universities tend to prioritise profit over student well-being, and that's because of this system that the government have created and governments before have created. So this marketised system just isn't fit to support students' well-being or mental health. So I think there needs to be serious system change before we actually get to see student mental health get properly better.
Thank you. Robin.
Thank you, Chair. Gerd, you've been very upfront about the fact that you're sceptical at this stage that the statutory duty is the answer. Perhaps rather than just ask for everyone's position on the statutory duty, I can ask what benefits do you think it might offer? And we will have to weigh up in the debate and as a committee the benefits and potential risks or disbenefits. So perhaps if you could just talk through, from your perspective, where you see any potential risks of a statutory duty. And I think you've all said, and I think we all accept, that this is more complicated than simply a piece of legislation. I'm sure the previous witnesses would agree to that. It's about a whole system approach. But we've heard some quite persuasive arguments as to why that could move universities in the right direction. So perhaps if you could expand on some of the risks that you perhaps see on introducing a statutory duty and any downsides, and then put the same question to Dominic afterwards.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Robin. I found myself reflecting on the train on the way down yesterday, saying I'm not as against this as I'm not for it. It's a very, very difficult place, you know, and if you like, the parents and particularly your Mark online was saying, you know, it's evolution rather than revolution. I think we're not too far away from that ourselves. From Papyrus's point of view, everyone so far has credited Universities UK with the guidance, that we actually wrote it with them and for them. And like these parents are working with Universities UK as a body to say, come on, let's create what our colleague previously said, this is basic, it's not best practice, this should be done. But the shift from should to must, one of the risks is already we see most prevalently a rescinding of energy. When somebody senses that somebody else needs immediate emotional response, most of us are pretty good, but don't touch the word suicide. And most people, including us probably, default to thinking if we say something or do something, we'll make it worse. If I ask, are you thinking about suicide, which is something in our guidance we encourage, people recoil and think that's foolish, that's going to make it worse. My worry is if you put a framework that says you must, people will recoil even further and avoid any natural intervention they would ordinarily make. My other sort of reflection is going back to what I said about reports into prevention of future deaths. Outside this sector, there is a statutory duty. If I go to my GP, he should share information to protect me if I'm under 19. That's absolutely codified by the GMC. I have lost count of the number of inquests wherein a GP has been found wanting, and no disrespect to GPs in the room or elsewhere, where information sharing is just not happening. There is already a statutory duty there. It doesn't protect the child.
Thank you. Dominic?
I think in terms of the benefits, there are some things we acknowledge would be valuable in this petition, in calling for more pressure being put on the sector to engage with the frameworks and practice that does exist. I think how we can learn from tragic incidents, it is really important that universities engage with the processes so that we can ensure tragedies are preventable in the future. I suppose in terms of the risks, from the consultation we've done with students and clinicians to understand their perspectives on this, the worry is the impact this could have on staff and just adding a lot more pressure on them when they're already potentially in a position where they're feeling quite stretched. So if we're not resourcing them to engage with the framework, resourcing them to build up partnerships with NHS, as Chloe acknowledged, resourcing universities to be supporting students with the challenges they're facing around financial hardship, accessing the NHS when they do have clinical levels of care, that we're just putting more pressure on them without actually providing them the support to engage with the practice that they need to embed. There's a lot more concern around recognising that even if we do have the fully well-resourced health services, we don't know that this will be a silver bullet that will prevent all suicides completely. There's a worry that there's just a mismanagement of expectations here with the best practice we do currently have. There's still a lot of unknown from the evidence available to us. Some of the practice that was referenced around information sharing and guidance that was put out, and the lack of take-up in it. I know research was done just a couple of years ago looking at the pilot at Bristol with information sharing that actually found some of the most vulnerable students, the ones who hope to be engaging with those interventions, are the least likely to opt in the process. So whether they're actually what we're currently calling best practice or even essential might not even be effective in the way we need it to be. So recognising that need for a broad spectrum of interventions and initiatives to make sure we catch students wherever possible, because it may save some lives, but no one intervention is going to save all of them.
And I mean, I think we can sort of take that as accepted, that you're not going to rule out suicides altogether in any sector, sadly. But I guess the question is, does it do more good than harm? Is it going to move things in the right direction? And just to your point about staff, of course, universities do have a duty of care to their staff, and they have a legal duty as employers. I think one of the things that struck me as the evidence we've heard is that distinction that's been drawn between the duty of care as it applies to an employer and a duty of care as it applies to children. And I think, as chairman of the Education Select Committee, I think that is an important distinction. I think it is very important we keep children and the sort of loco parentis issue separate from this. But when it comes to the duty of care for employers, do you think there's something that universities could do in terms of a contract with students to say, actually, yes, we will look after you? Is that would that potentially be an alternative to a statutory duty, or do you, or actually is a statutory duty the better way of addressing this in a way that makes the whole sector, in all its diversity, move to address it?
Yeah, fantastic question and framing. I think there definitely is appetite from students to understand and get clarity on what the responsibility of the university currently is. As I think the panel before rightly pointed out, the lack of understanding and confusion just from what's communicated to them about what they can expect does need to be cleared up. Whether that needs to be done through a statutory duty, I'm not sure we're convinced, but I do think there is definitely the desire for the sector to clarify its current position and potentially improve it as well.
Just conscious, Chloe's online and whether she wanted to come in on any of that, or Tanya's got questions as well.
Yeah, I've got some thoughts on the kind of proposal of statutory duty.
Order. We will need to suspend the hearing very quickly as we have a division, a vote in the House of Commons. So can we suspend, please, until
I'm certainly not.
we have to suspend for 15 minutes.
Or two.
Yeah, until 1:45. My apologies.
Apologies.
is currently suspended. The proceeding 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 is currently suspended. The proceeding
for the interruption for the vote. I know, Chloe, you were about to come in, I think, just as we took a break there, a short pause. But Tonya, I know, has got some other questions. So I was going to bring Tonya in with her questions. And then, Chloe, if you've got anything to add from what we were discussing previously, you can incorporate it into your response.
Hi Chloe, what are your views on existing support that universities provide to students?
So I think the existing support isn't really there, but I think the structures aren't particularly there. I think there's a whole host of reasons. I think one of the reasons is because universities have become the first become almost like the only port of call for students if they're suffering from mental health, because of the failures of the NHS and the kind of long waiting lists that the NHS have. Students really struggle to get through to that NHS service. So I think there is a huge number of students who try to access that support. But like I said earlier, there is an issue with universities not particularly prioritising money there, but it's not always about the money, it's about the systems that exist. They're also often not quite there. I think, and I already kind of said this before, so forgive me for repeating, but there is that wider problem where universities just aren't always allowed to succeed in supporting students when it comes to mental health. The systems just aren't there. Like I said, the NHS system isn't there to support, also providing student support. And it's not that staff aren't willing to support the students in their mental health. It's that they often can't, and they don't have capabilities or the capacity to provide the support that students need. And that's due to kind of university system, the marketized system, kind of prioritizing maybe funding like new buildings instead of kind of put it into sports service. That's not always necessarily the case in universities, but we do see it a lot. And a lot of the time, students' well-being, stuff that would improve students' well-being, such as even just smaller class sizes, more financial support, stuff like that, the system doesn't allow for that. So there's the wider kind of systemic problems, which don't really allow universities to succeed. I think also talking about what we spoke about before, kind of what is my position on this proposal for statutory duty of care, I do agree there does need to be more standardised regulation of university processes. There is a lot of, it's not very clear often how to access mental health systems within universities. It's not clear who to talk to. As someone who also went through university mental health support and counselling. I really struggled with it, especially because you're kind of, like I said before, like you're there for a short amount of time at university throughout the year, and then when you're not at university, it almost feels like you don't have as much access to the counselling, as in like during the holidays. But I also have a few concerns about statutory duty of care around, especially the kind of views around data sharing, and data sharing around like communicating with parents. I think there's definitely a lot of cases where parents would be beneficial to know, but I think we've got to think about as well the dangers that could be faced for students from very vulnerable family backgrounds, such as LGBTQ plus students who might not be out to their family. And we also know for a fact that LGBTQ plus students are more likely to suffer from mental illnesses. There's also students who are from maybe potentially abusive families or kind of toxic family situations, who it might be that the university contacts their family and that makes things worse, and also could potentially prevent students from reaching out for help due to fear of information being shared that they don't want reaching out to their family. There's also something that I'm concerned about is a precedent that's being set. If this came in place, if universities are kind of, a fear is instigating them about being sued, that could release positive stuff, such as like what people have said about kind of giving them a kick to provide more support, provide better policies around mental health. However, I do worry about precedent being set that could negatively impact students, which could be like the over-policing and intrusion from universities to students. And we already know this for a fact, that students already feel like universities can often over-police students, such as kind of like doing room searches in university accommodations, and stuff like that. And kind of there's been instances where universities have kind of kept surveillance on students. So that we worry about that kind of being exacerbated if universities have this fear of being sued. They might kind of be intrusive on students' lives, and obviously that you then could lose a sense of autonomy. And I think it was mentioned before about this kind of push of when people who are suffering mental illness feel like they're losing their autonomy, that can also make things worse. So obviously this would all be about implementation, but these are just some concerns that I have about what could arise from this bill.
And I think many of those concerns are valid, and I think Robin Walker brought up the fact that there could be a kind of parent agreement, that there was a contract, that at the beginning of the university term there was something agreed. But moving on one of the points that you mentioned, and earlier we heard about not all students being able to access the services, not being able to access, but it's not appropriate for all students to have access to these services because they won't all need them. My son is currently at university, and one of the things that I'm taken aback by is how when they're in student accommodation, they form groups of friends, and then there are outliers who don't have those friendships or haven't got that bond. Are you aware of any initiatives in your university that may be looking after raising awareness with other students that aren't necessarily going to access these services, but can support others who they may identify to be able to access them? You know, for example, I'd say to you, come on now, Chloe, let's, you can, are you okay? Just literally that conversation. Is there any work being done around that?
I mean, I can't talk for all universities because every university is different. They all have different schemes, but I do think there is a lack of that. And I think there is a lack of kind of, like I mentioned before about intrusion, but I do think there are positives in interventions that could be made, and I do think universities do potentially lack that. Potentially, if someone's not turned up to their lectures for a while and that's been noticed, is there any, I don't think there's any kind of standardized kind of policy where universities would then reach out to the student if they have kind of like not been attending. And I think they are definitely stuff that could be really vital, and especially in accommodations where and in that first year of doing your undergrad, they can be really vulnerable times. So providing that community is really important. I don't particularly know of any specific universities like running any schemes, but I do know that is an area that universities are kind of lacking in, and also just building a community. That is a big problem at universities at the moment.
Okay, thanks Chloe. Jed, I was going to go to Dominic, but then come to you, so hold that thought. Dominic, you know, we've heard about the charter, and we heard earlier that only 5 universities have taken on that charter. Is it 5 or are there more?
So the charter, when we talk about it, is broken up into different sections. So we've got the framework, which is all of the research that outlines all of the principles of good practice that universities can be utilising to work towards self-assess, self-audit their own work before they submit themselves for an award. So that's public. All universities can engage with the research in the framework already. The programme membership, which is essentially how universities commit to the framework, show their public commitment to it and start to join in events, to share that learning, that best practice, learn from each other. There's 61 universities currently signed up, and we're opening for next year's academic submission over the summer, hoping to get a huge surge. Really, that's something we want the whole sector to be engaging in as soon as possible, showing that commitment to those principles. In terms of the award, only 5 institutions have achieved award status. That's not to say 5 institutions have gone through the award process. So we don't publicly share institutions that have gone through, have received their report, which is very extensive in getting a long list of recommendations on how they can improve their practice across different themes and areas. The ratification for awards only happens twice a year, so we're due to have a ratification panel in July, where we'll be looking at all of the awards that have taken over the last 6 months. So the award scheme has only been up and running for about 18 months, about a year today since we did our first on-site visit, so still in the very early days of going through this process. It's quite a long process from when the universities first indicate they want to submit for the award through to collating their evidence, submitting it, getting that assessed by assessors, us doing the on-site visit, then writing the report back to them. It can be anywhere between a 6 to 12 month process from submission through to the award being public. So currently we can say 5 have achieved the award, but a lot more have engaged with the programme than is currently advertised, and we're seeing that ramp up quite significantly, and hopeful we'll have all institutions engage with the process in the next 10 years at least once is our mission.
Okay. Jed, do you want to go back to what you wanted to say? Sorry.
Not to be too personal, Tonya, but you said that a member of your family has friends and there are outliers. My experience, sadly, is there's no type to suicide. We all assume that it's going to be the person who's out on their own. I've lost count of the parents who say, my child was surrounded by hundreds of friends. Yeah. And when we talk about isolation and suicide ideation, I always remember a story where a woman rang our helpline. I answered it was many years ago, and she said she had the point of the story really is to say, at one level, she contacted us through Siri. She screamed at her phone and said, hey Siri, I'm going to kill myself. And it said, ring this helpline, and she did. But in telling that story, she said, that's the thing. I went through my Facebook followers and my Instagram followers and my Twitter and there were hundreds of them. But there was none of those people I could share my suicidal ideation with, except you. So I think we have to be careful that we don't miss the reality, learning from previous deaths. Most people don't fit into a typology. Yeah. Second, I think, I don't know where this came from, but during the discussion, I think we've got to be wary of pathologising emotional distress. It's normal for us to have difficult days, and I think there's a tendency, I'm not going to say too much on this, but if we're not careful, everybody needs a service. They don't. All the sort of psychosocial models I've ever worked with are sort of a pyramid shape, at the top of which people that need acute care, down here we need education and occasional care. And I think we've got to be careful that we don't try to fix everything with a service. And in terms of your question about the status of the sector, I'm probably not the right one to ask because I'm not in the HAI sector, but my sense is that people, Chloe hinted at this, there is a desire to help. There's an awful lot of good work from academic and non-academic staff, formal and informal care, and from young and other older students to their peers as well. So I've been going around the country talking about our guidance, and I put up a slide which says, at the beginning of my presentation, thank you for listening. And I say, that's all I want to say. And they think that's the presentation. We forget at our peril the amount of wonderful care that's happening in the university world. That's not going to grab a headline. There's an awful lot of work that's already happening that prevents deaths every day.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for that, Jed. Really, really appreciate it. I'll tie up now, and I know that Chloe has touched on this as well, but just a quick sentence. Do you think universities have the resources and expertise to identify and take appropriate action when students are suffering from poor mental health? Jed?
My version of that question, do you think society has? The answer is yes, but we're still frightened of talking about suicide. We need to get over ourselves and talk about suicide more openly so that young people don't need to hide it. They can talk about it and get the help they deserve.
Yeah, thank you. Dominic?
I think we've created a lot of frameworks and guidance and policies to support universities to engage with that. So I believe they're ready to be equipped, but in terms of resourcing and capacity, potentially need some more support in order to engage with those processes fully, and also have the pressure to do so, because I do acknowledge there is that worry to engage in them sometimes. So more to be done for sure.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Chloe, do you want the last word?
Yeah, I'm going to have to disagree with Jed here, unfortunately. I do think there is a problem with speaking out about stuff, but I think a lot of people now are speaking out and they're screaming out for help, but it's just not there. And I think the universities don't have capacity, and the system doesn't work for them to be able to be in capacity. So I think there needs to be a huge amount of structural and systematic change to achieve what we want to achieve.
Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for your time today and for your patience as well. It's much appreciated, and there's a huge amount to take away and digest from what you've all said today, so thank you. And can we now have our third panel, who've waited very patiently, and we have Jill, who is here in person, and we have Professor Steve West, who is here virtually.
Hi, good afternoon.
And so just to warm up your voices, if you'd like to just briefly introduce yourselves and say where you come from, please. Starting with you, Jill.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for having me. So I'm Jill Stevenson. I am the chair of Amoshi, which is the Student Services Organisation. I work at the University of Stirling as Director of Student Services there, but here today as chair of Amoshi.
Thank you. And Professor West?
Thank you, Steve West. I'm Vice Chancellor at the University of the West of England in Bristol. I'm also currently President of Universities UK, and I've chaired the Mental Health in Higher Education Group, which is a network across the sector and agencies, including Department of Health and Social Care and bereaved families. And I've been doing that for about 8 years now.
Okay, thank you. Nick, do you want to come in there?
Yes, thank you for coming to this session today. So we just finished the last session saying that there was some good work going off in universities. So I want to start this session by giving you the opportunity to say what you actually think that your responsibilities are and what you are actually currently doing at this moment in time. And if we could start with you, Jill, and then we'll go over to Steve.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so the primary responsibility of universities is to provide education and learning to our students, and to provide a living and learning environment that is conducive to that, also to conduct research and enable innovation and knowledge exchange. So it's to create that environment that allows that to happen. So I think for universities it's putting the resources into the frameworks that can support those things happening. So from some of the examples that we're taking already, Many universities are obviously implementing the guidance that has been cited several times today. There's guidance that's been produced by Universities UK Paris in partnership with Emoshi and the sector on sharing information with trusted contacts, preventing suicide and the post-vention work. And I think one point I would really want to stress is that some of that guidance was only published last year, and I think we really need the opportunity to implement that. There's been a lot of discussion about numbers. Emoshi just recently with the UK asked our members, are you implementing that? Is it being implemented, or are there plans to do that? And the vast majority of the respondents are saying yes, we're doing that. So putting that guidance into place is one of the things. Over and above that, universities already have, many of them, mental health strategies and agreements with students in place. I think what's important about that is that we take whole institution approaches. It's not just about student services, which is the Emoshi remit, but these strategies will typically look at wellbeing initiatives, prevention, community building, referral pathways, and then onto the acute end as well in terms of what we would do to support that. And often these strategies are developed in partnership with our students as well. So the student agency is there. And in terms of accountability, university courts, our governing bodies, would be the ones that would approve those strategies. There has been significant investment, I think, across the sector in support for students who need that when they are struggling. You can ask any university. I think the vast majority of them will tell you about the investment they've had to make in counselling, but laterally mental health provision. So that's more clinical support, mental health nurses, for example, and psychologists. And I think, as has already been cited today, this is because of the gaps in the NHS and the gaps in funding that are there. But universities absolutely have invested and put that money in there. I think also we were talking about legislation, and one thing that hasn't really been talked about is that we have talked about the debate over whether there's a general duty of care, but there are other pieces of legislation there which we very much comply with. So the Equality Act, for example, which requires universities to put adjustments in place, both anticipatory and reasonable adjustments in response to students who have disabilities, including mental health conditions. And there's a significant framework of support that already exists there. So that's, again, not just with student services, but also with academic colleagues as well. So I'll stop there, but if you want to know any more, please do.
Thank you for that. And Steve?
Thank you. Can I just start by, again, thanking the parents, bereaved families who have got the courage to actually stand up. And I've worked with many of the families, and I've worked with families and parents over many years to try and ensure that we learn and work together. So my condolences to them all, but also my thanks for being brave and courageous and being able to stand up and share their stories with us, because that's how we work and learn. So university leaders, 10 years ago, this was not something that was spoken about at all. Mental health well-being really wasn't something on the radar in universities. And that is, I think, a very important thing to say, because over the last 8 years, I think we have got focused, I think we have made improvements, and we are changing many, many lives across the spectrum of mental health and well-being. And universities have stepped up, but I would be the first to absolutely acknowledge that we need to go further, faster, and we need to ensure that everyone in our university sector is engaging with the best practice, and we're learning together. So I think there are many elements within the Learn Network that we would absolutely support and want to engage around. Our job is to create safe, inclusive, and healthy settings for students and staff, and to share information in a way that ensures that we keep students at the centre of our decisions, and making sure that we care about them and we care about their mental health and well-being. And to demonstrate that, we need to progress the sector frameworks collectively and without fear. We need to ensure that the mistakes that happen in all institutions are learnt from, and that we do this with compassion and transparency. And I think many of the things that we've heard today demonstrates the complexity of mental health continuum. So everything from poor mental health to mental illness through to the tragic events that we see across our institutions with suicide. And that has a profound impact on university staff and students, and of course the families and friends. So I think that we want to deliver as best we can within the education setting that safe, inclusive environment. I don't believe that the statutory duty of care necessarily will help us do that. I do believe that a laser focus and uptake of the frameworks that are already in play absolutely does need to happen. And we might want to talk about those in a moment. But it starts with, let's be very clear, 1 in 4 students have diagnosed mental health issues, with 1/3 recording poor mental well-being. And what we're seeing in our universities and we're seeing in society is increasing severity and complexity of presentation, and the same is true within the NHS settings, and the NHS settings are finding it increasingly difficult to provide services, recruit staff and retain staff, and therefore there is higher and higher expectations being placed on universities at this time. And that fundamentally is part of what we're trying to deal with. And part of this is to recognise how we get the continuum of poor mental health as well as the acute episodes, and how we recognise and support those students. And there is best practice there, and there are frameworks that we can use to do that.
Robin.
Yeah, thank you. You've said that you don't think statutory duty of care would necessarily help. And I just think it would be useful to expand on that, because I guess we've got to weigh up the arguments on both sides. We've heard suggestion that you have a greater legal duty to your staff than you do to students. And yet students are key to universities. They are, at the end of the day, your customers, as well as people who live in your institutions in many cases. What is the answer to why a statutory duty of care on the same basis as you have towards employees wouldn't be, in your view, appropriate for students?
So the statutory duty of care for employees is enshrined within employment law, and there's a contract, a very clear contract between the employer and the employee. And there's a level of, in effect, there is a level of control that we can have within that environment. The difficulty in the students' space is that we don't have that level of control and influence in the same way. Now, schools have a degree of influence and control in school children, and you quite rightly earlier pointed out that safeguarding in schools is very different to what happens in adult education settings. We have to remember that for many of our students, they are attending multiple different settings, and sometimes not even on campuses. They're engaging with universities remotely. Very few, actually, of our students live on campus, in campus halls. The vast majority of students are living at home or are living within communities in multiple occupancy dwellings or halls that are outside the university. So we have a very complex and a very diverse picture. We do have a general duty of care, and we do have to ensure that what we do in our institutions recognise the importance of ensuring that we do create safe and inclusive environments within which people can thrive and flourish. And that means engineering out, wherever we can, risk, and reducing risks. And of course, that does apply to the settings that students are engaging with whilst they're at university. The difficulty is when they're not here. And they're not here for many, many different reasons. And that's when it becomes difficult in terms of a statutory duty of care. We simply don't have the level of control that you would see in a hospital, in a school setting, in other environments. And we should also recognise, even in school settings, with that statutory duty of care, we are seeing increasing numbers, tragically, of young people taking their lives.
And To come back, I mean, some of the examples that we've heard about in terms of issues which have been reported and not acted on for periods of time, I mean, surely those fail the test of a general duty of care. And the argument would be, without some form of statutory framework, there is no accountability for that. Do you recognise that that's a valid concern?
I absolutely do, and I think that I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be a mechanism whereby university sector is held to account. I think we absolutely do need that. The question is the statutory duty of care the best way of doing that? Now, interestingly, an earlier witness started to describe something which I thought was quite interesting, which was a support excellence framework in a similar way to other frameworks that we have in the sector. Now, that's quite a creative way of thinking about how do we ensure that there are guidelines that are then adopted and measured against through a mechanism. And that could be in England anyway, it could be the Office for Students, or it could be the Office for the Independent Adjudicator, or it could be a combination of Department for Education, Minister and University. There are different ways in which we can get the accountability. I think it's important that we find a mechanism to do this, because what we've heard today is evidence and anecdotal information. One of the things that we do need to do is to create the evidence base and the learning and some frameworks that everybody adopts to make sure we're collecting information in the same way and we're learning from the tragic events, but not just those, I would argue, near misses that occur in universities as well. Because as Jed said, universities are saving many, many, many lives by the work that we've been doing over many, many years.
And sorry, just one more on this, because do you think there will be negative consequences, Jill, for the space that you work in, of student services and support for students from having a statutory duty? I find it difficult to see what negative consequences there could be, but do you feel that there are risks on that front?
Yeah. I think there are three kind of unintended consequences of this kind of duty. One is that I think it takes us back to a place where we're focusing on compliance and the risk of doing things wrong, rather than facilitating that culture of continuous improvement where we're all working together. I think that's what we have been working on, and I think that's where we need to be. I don't want us to go back to a place where it's what's the basic minimum we need to do in terms of complying with legislation, because this is ultimately about culture change. So we believe that additional duty of care will actually put us backwards and will not drive that continuous culture of change. I think from our practitioners that work in student services, there are real fears about retribution and people being held personally accountable for failings, for mistakes, and I think the fear of litigation and retribution means that some people that are working in this area feel that this is not something they would want to engage in. So we're worried about the risk of the drain of talented professionals working both in student services but also in the academic sphere if we go down this route rather than an enhancement approach. Second unintended consequence, I think, is around the diversion of resources from areas that we should legitimately be investing in this space into areas of where we shouldn't be. So, for example, you're already seeing that happening in universities where we are, as I mentioned earlier, investing more and more and more in mental health nurses, for example, because of this gap in the NHS. If we feel more risk on us, there could be more of that type of investment. But actually what we should be doing is investing those resources in the types of support that will prevent people getting to this place in the first place. So academic tutors, the student support professionals to help them engage with learning rather than the clinical end of the spectrum. Residential life programmes, that means students can come out, work together, have fun together. Training programmes for students to be able to help support and refer each other if that's needed. If universities are having to put the resources more into essentially risk management and the avoidance of us being told we've done the wrong thing, then absolutely those resources are going to be moved over into the wrong place. That said, we absolutely support further work on engagement with the NHS and the partnerships that can be made there, but there needs to be the resources in place, and I would urge government to be thinking about that too. My third unintended consequence, it relates to that risk, and it was something that was mentioned earlier, but I think there's a real danger that higher education providers are going to avoid taking on risk for supporting students if this additional duty of care is introduced. I think one thing that's not been really mentioned today, and it's really important to note, attending university is acknowledged to be a protective factor. I think Steve mentioned it, but there's a absolute, massive amount of good work going on, and the suicide rate at university is significantly lower compared with the wider population, and I can provide the stats on that. That's not stated to dismiss the tragedy of each suicide. We all feel this tragedy immensely. We stand with parents in wanting changes and more professional support, and we can't imagine the distress that's been caused. But the reason I talk about this protective factor is to give an indication that universities are not complacent, that they are investing support, and actually that support framework is already providing that supportive environment for students. So if this duty of care came to us and we felt more risk averse, it's more likely, for example, that universities will be moving students to fitness to study procedures earlier than they would be now. At the moment, we try to put support frameworks in place to retain students at university, but there is a risk that of getting this wrong or of potential litigation, retribution, that students would be essentially fast-tracked towards fitness to study processes, which would exit them from universities because of that risk. Now, that means they then wouldn't be engaging with universities, so that protective factor is gone. And the other risk, I think, that was mentioned was students, if they feel that they're going to then be moved into fitness to study, or if universities are going to have to take more extreme steps, that they'd be afraid to come forward for support in the first place. They'd be concerned that they could be put on fitness to study measures, concerned that the very people in their family networks that are actually exacerbating their mental health may be contacted, for example. So, just we need to think about the risks and that real risk of that protective factor being removed from students.
Tanya, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, if you don't mind. It was something that Steve said, but I think Jill could probably, there is a lot of good work going on, but what we've heard from the parents, it's about the consistent practice, the good practice. There's obviously great work that we've heard going on with the Mind Charter, but how is that then kind of implemented? There's no, Mark said earlier, that, they're looking for an evolution of policy rather than a revolution. And suicide is a preventable death. One of my takeaways was what Jed said about society, talk about, has society got the resources, not just universities? And the answer is that society hasn't really got the resources. And Steve made the point about, I can't remember what it is. Typical, writing too much down. But the whole thing about the resources not being there, one of the things you've spoken about is you're scared of litigation, scared of putting things in place that are going to hold you accountable, not you personally, but the institutions accountable. Surely, going back to this, it's evolution, not revolution. And how can you pull together the services that you have at the universities and have that parity across all universities in the United Kingdom, so that these young people and older people, mature students and foreign students, have that support network moving forward? How can we break that fear for you to do that? And remembered what you said, Steve. You said about there being an evidence base, because what we've heard today is anecdotal. For me, who is to do that research? Where is it? Who's responsible? Is it the Office of Student? Is it you?
I mean, fantastic questions, and I think you've gone to the hub. The first thing to say is that at the moment this is England only, that this is being considered. So the devolved nations have a different way of engaging with this. That said, the Universities UK is 4 nations, and I'm pleased to say that many of the things that the UK has developed in partnership with Papyrus, Student Minds, with families, and with the NHS, are being adopted across all nations. So I'll give you one example. The Suicide Safer Universities, which is a UUK framework, we have just done a snap poll in terms of the guidance, and we asked how many universities have adopted it. We've got a response rate of 83 universities out of 115. The poll was open for 4 days. This is England only. 99% have adopted the suicide safer universities. 89% have adopted or adopting the placement guidance. There was a whole raft of additional areas. 93% have adopted or adopting the trusted contact guidance, and 100% have adopted or adopting postvention guidance. So one of the things that we've done as a sector is collected some data. However, I think there is further work to do in terms of the way in which we systematically investigate tragic events that occur very infrequently in our universities. Nevertheless, they occur, and we have a systematic way of recording and engaging with parents, friends, as we're doing this, as part of the contribution to coroners, but also to collect in the same way, my background's health, in the same way that we do it as a serious incident in the health systems. We have a systematic approach, and we should have an independent, in my view, mechanism whereby all of those documentations are sent to a single source, researchers who are working in the NHS, who are used to looking at these things and pulling out the learnings that we can share across the sector, and can be used then to ensure that we do demonstrate the learning. We do enact that learning, which is one, I think, of the frustrations that I've heard from families. There are other things that were mentioned earlier about the Student Minds Charter. And it's really interesting that both the UUK work and Student Minds align very, very well. And there is a mechanism at the moment that's been led by ministers, previous ministers, they're not there anymore, who required all universities in England, again, because it's a devolved matter, to engage with and have in place the Student Minds University Mental Health Charter. We're on the journey, we're not there yet, but very importantly, it's not a tick box. It is about enhancement, and it is about ensuring that we learn and develop as we go. And that's critical, and it's why it's such actually a very big piece of work for a university to do. A whole university approach involving staff and students, and actually being accountable for the delivery of what we sign up for. So we've got some things in train. The question is, how do we make sure that we pull all of this together and we report it and demonstrate the progress that's being made, rather than it just sitting in individual universities? We need to pool it to really have impact.
I don't know if anyone wanted to come in there. I mean, we've been, you've been very generous with your time and being patient with us, with our parliamentary processes and votes coming in the middle. I think we've covered a huge amount today, and there's obviously more to look at and consider and digest before we have the debate that's coming up. Nick, did you want to comment?
Yeah, just one question. One of the panellists earlier, it's slightly off topic, well, it's on topic but off topic. It was just something that I was concerned about. He said that the attendance to the lectures is often around 50%. If you're not seeing students, then you've got an issue there, haven't you? Can you just briefly tell me, is that normal for attendance to be so low at 50%? And do you agree with me that if students aren't there, then it's very difficult to help them? And surely one thing that you could do as a university, and students as well, is make sure students actually attend lectures and are part of the campus. Is that...
Okay,
so again,
who are you directing that to? Shall we bring...
Both.
Yeah. Shall we bring Jill in first? Give you a slight break, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. I can cover in a moment. Yeah, I think a couple of points. One is about the diversity. So that 50% statistic, it will depend on universities and their models. Not every university has that typical model of students coming into lectures and attending in that way. There's lots of online delivery models, there's hybrid models, so I think we need to be careful about that statistic. But I think it goes back to the point about these being adult learners and being able to engage with their studies how they see fit. You know, not everybody comes and sits and has a lecture. They will engage with studies in different ways. They will read, they will research. So it is incredibly difficult to track where everybody is all the time, and that goes back to this really fundamental point that's been raised today about, which is why we think the duty of care is so difficult, because universities cannot have that level of control and that level of monitoring in the same way that, you know, an employer might with the employee, or a school might with children, because they're seeing them every day. You know, that relationship is fundamentally different. You know, all of us have learners that are studying remotely, studying online, not living on campus. So if it was to go down a route there where universities were, you know, to be expected to do that, that is a significant resource implication. So, you know, I think we need to be careful about that. And if that is, if that requirement to check in on that basis, so that we know where every student is at all times, you know, that's a significant resource implication, and that infrastructure would need to fundamentally change.
Steve?
So I think that was one of the things that I was saying. We simply don't have that level of control. These are adult learners, and they're making choices about how and when they engage. Now, we hope that we create an environment where they'll want to engage, either online or directly on campus, in workshops, in seminars, in tutorials, and in our workshops. There are universities at the moment who are using student engagement as a mechanism to begin to spot when a student might disengage. Now, that's a very big, I guess, a big high-level statement. What does that mean? It means that we use data sources and data analytics to look at when students are engaging with us and profiling them in a number of different ways. So we'll look at them engaging with the virtual learning environments, engaging with the library, engaging with virtual environments that they're using to submit work. We'll look at them in terms, if they're on campus, we'll look at them in terms of how they're using their accommodation. All of those data points are then looked at to look at whether or not we're seeing a change in a student's behaviour, which might indicate that they're disengaging, because we know loneliness and disengagement is an early warning sign. So then we have mechanisms whereby we can start to nudge and engage with the student and inquire how the student is. And then try and work with the student to understand what's changing, what's going on, why have your marks dipped, why are you not engaging, and take them on that journey and encourage them where we can to engage where necessary if we have serious concerns, and this was mentioned earlier, with their trusted contact. Now, that trusted contact may be a parent, but it may not be a parent. And I think that I'm certainly very clear about the GDPR, and I would absolutely, where there is threat to an individual's life or the life of others, have no hesitation whatsoever in contacting the trusted contact. It's not always the parent, and that's one of the things that we have to understand, because sometimes that parental environment isn't the right environment. But nevertheless, where we can, I will work with students, sometimes personally, to engage with their trusted contact. It's essential. And I would also say this is hugely important for parents and supporters when students are coming to university, that there is full disclosure of anything that someone is worried about. And I would also argue we need to make sure that there are lines that people can use if they have concerns about their loved ones, whether it's from a student, a member of staff, or a parent or loved one. And we've got all of those things in place. And that's why I think over the last 10 years, we've seen a significant advancement and improvements. And let's just remember, every death is potentially avoidable, but we need to know, because 50%, tragically, of those deaths in our institutions were never recognised. They were never expected. The student wasn't seen as high risk by their families, their friends, the NHS services, or universities. And that's the tragedy of this. It's hugely complex. Every story is slightly different. It's very different across the age ranges. And unfortunately, we just don't know enough about how our interventions work and have impact. And prevention in this space has to be our focus. So prevention, promotion, intervention, and postvention, tragically, when something goes wrong. And each journey is a learning one.
Thank you. Very quick follow-up.
Final.
Just you made the point about trusted contacts, and that does seem to be two of the cases we heard from parents where that clearly wasn't the approach taken. We have heard about this conflict with the law, or theoretical conflict with the law, when it comes to GDPR. You've been clear you don't agree with that, and clearly there are universities that take a different approach. But isn't there something about saying that should be something that the sector could embrace across the board? Isn't that something that every university could sign up to, having a trusted contact policy, and absolutely take the points from the NUS about the concerns of taking that too far, but with the right opt-outs for people and the ability to choose who their trusted contact is, surely all that can be managed. Why isn't that something that can be universal sort of right now, rather than something which requires frameworks and years of engagement to deliver?
Well, I think Mr. Fryer, I think quite well identified that actually the information and guidance is absolutely there. Where we are in a situation where we are engaging with possible risk to life or others, then there are no restrictions around GDPR. We should be taking action. It's been every Vice Chancellor has had a letter outlining that and saying that must be the case, and it should be embedded and enshrined in their mentally healthy universities frameworks, which universities are encouraged to have. On this one, this is too important for us to duck that particular issue. I don't believe that Vice Chancellors have. I do believe that that ability to contact where we should contact happens. And where it doesn't, then there is no excuse.
Yeah, and I guess the question is, so where's the accountability? But that's the big challenge of the issue that we're debating. So thank you so much for your answering all our questions and staying with us as late as you have. We do very much appreciate it, and it's been hugely informative, and it will really help to inform next month's debate on Mr. Fryatt's petition. Order.
Portcullis House. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.